This is Professor Porter, one video talking about implied malice in involuntary manslaughter. So we'll remember from our common law definition of malice aforethought, it had those four parts that we're pulling from the common law and inserting in most of our murder statutes: the intent to kill, intent to cause grievous bodily injury, felony murder, which we'll cover in its own independent video, and then kind of this oddly placed one that we classify as implied malice. I mean, technically, felony murder is implied malice. Intent to cause grievous bodily injury where death results is implied malice. But the real one we're talking about when we refer to, a murder or implied malice statute is talking about depraved heart or malignant heart. It has a lot of different names, but it's important to make sure we have a working definition, especially for our rule statement funnel. If we're evaluating anytime, whether they're offered a statute or we're evaluating purely on common law, a fact pattern against, what are the different considerations? What could the defendant be charged with? You're always going to consider common law murder, the unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought, and you're going to go down this line. So if it's not the specific intent to kill, if it's not a felony murder fact pattern, you're often going to devote part of the essay to depraved heart. Is a good definition. It's an act if deliberately performed by a person who knows the conduct endangers the life of another and who acts in conscious disregard for that life. So you see that language crop up all the time. I think that's a little more intuitive, conscious disregard for human life. So if we're playing Russian roulette, if we're driving 100 miles an hour on a busy sidewalk, those things those are acts taken, deliberately taken, that show a conscious disregard for human life. Here's the way the Model Penal Code puts it. You can see extreme indifference. That's the word that's behind the camera there. Extreme indifference to the value of human life. So that conscious disregard for human life, extreme indifference towards human life, and you'll see these common law phrases and common law descriptions that come through of depraved heart or malignant heart. We're able to label someone as having a depraved heart when they act in this way with an extreme indifference or with a conscious disregard for human life. So it's not just recklessness. It's certainly more than gross negligence, but it's the type of recklessness as it relates to whether someone lives and dies, the value of human life, the disregard for life. So these would be, additional statements, common law statements that you can put in your rule statement funnel from which you can argue both for the prosecution of whether someone could be charged or from the defense as to whether, as to how it would shake out as a verdict. Here's if we look at some statutes. I've referred to the federal statute a few times, 18 United States Code 1111, and you see, again, we borrow the phrase malice aforethought. So it's going to come with that 1, 2, 3, 4. It's going to come with intent to kill, intent to create grievous bodily injury, felony murder of a specific variety. Some are outlined for murder in the first degree, some are outlined in murder in the second degree. But what we're talking about here is what's included as far as depraved heart, malignant heart. See, here's the jury instruction that goes with the 1111 prosecution. It says malice aforethought, and of course we're telling jurors, we're telling people on the outside, so we have to make sure we define it. And they say to kill with malice aforethought means to kill, either intentionally, could have the intent to kill, or recklessly with extreme disregard for human life. So you see those same phrases even as we're instructing jurors coming up. So that's really what we mean by implied malice. It's still going to get us to a murder conviction in common law, or it's still going to get us to some degree of murder, often murder 2 under most penal codes. Next, we talked about, and we've talked about already in a previous video, manslaughter. Sometimes there's a discount coming from murder down to manslaughter. And we've talked about essentially what gets us there. Some type of adequate provocation, operating in the heat of passion, such that even though it was an intentional killing, it's going to be discounted down to voluntary manslaughter. Now, it's important to think about two parts of it as it relates to those elements, both the objective and the subjective tests that go along with heat of passion. Now, again, I explain voluntary manslaughter in a different video, so please check that out. But I want to speak for a second, 2 slides or so, about the objective part of this and the subjective part of it. So we're going to have reasonable provocation. Something's going to happen. There could be someone's stealing the car right in front of us and pushing us out of the way, right, and we're in at this provocation in that moment. And that we're going to look at whether it's reasonable. Would an ordinary person under same circumstances feel provoked? Would an ordinary person under similar circumstances lose their self-control, right? Those things are going to be certainly objective. But then that middle part, this adequate provocation, has to result in some sort of subjective anger to that person. So it can't be that the provocation would be something reasonable, would be someone throwing us out of our cars or about to entering it, going into work. But it doesn't faze the person. They're not actually subjectively affected at all. They just sort of go about, I can just take an Uber, I'll figure it out later. So both parts on the outside, objective provocation, objective standard as it relates to losing control, but they actually have to be heated. They actually have to have been affected. So there's sort of a subjective part and a couple objective parts that lead us to ultimately to the death to benefit from it. So don't lose sight of that, how you're evaluating, because anytime it's objective, you're going to be doing it against a reasonable person standard, and anytime it's subjective, we're going to look to the facts to say, under these circumstances, what actually happened with this person, what actually happened with the defendant. We don't just get to say, hey, ordinary person should have been bothered by this. It's, was this person bothered by this? Were they operating in the heat of passion and with not an adequate time to cool off? Here's some examples that you see. You see recklessly making its way into a manslaughter statute. This happens to be a Hawaii example where recklessly causes the death of another. So we're using, like the model penal code does, we're just using recklessly as the intent statute. So instead of purposefully, instead of knowingly, it's actually makes its way down to recklessly, and that level of intent translates to manslaughter. You can also see, instead of using phrases like provocation or heat of passion that come from the common law, there's been some movement to extreme mental or emotional disturbance. So I was affected in some way, and that operates as in the same way as an affirmative defense, as you see here, discounting down from murder or attempted murder down to manslaughter. And as we just discussed, they pull forward that reasonable person standard. The objective standard was, would a reasonable person under these circumstances be affected in this way, be pulled forward in this way. Here you see the federal manslaughter statute, which we broached in the other video having to do with voluntary manslaughter. So you see that same language, heat of passion, sudden quarrel. That would sort of pull forward, and there's other instructions that relate to what's the standard that we're using. But I think when you use the term heat of passion, we need adequate provocation from an objective standard. We need an actual heat of passion, actual anger that it affects the defendant, so subjective standard, and then objectively lost control that is a product of what causes the death of another human being without malice. So notice when we're talking about manslaughter, there is no malice. There's no sort of we're discounting from that intent to kill or intent to cause bodily harm that causes death because of the heat of passion. Someone temporarily loses control such that they can't appreciate their actions. But the federal statute then defines involuntary, and you can see this is a good definition that pulls from a lot of early statutes and a lot of statutes that you can see like this. It's something other than felony murder, because it's either an unlawful act that doesn't amount to a felony, some type of misdemeanor act or some type of violation of which death results, or maybe it's even the commission of a lawful act that produces death. So it could just be, hey, I'm closing the door to my apartment. That's a perfectly lawful act, but if I do it in such a way, in such a violent way, when someone's coming in, knowing that they're coming in, it hits them the right way and death results, even that lawful act that might produce death could under the right circumstances be involuntary manslaughter. Remember, we're always differentiating between an accident, can't be a crime. There has to be some type of culpability. There has to be some level of mens rea, some level of requisite required mens rea that's going on in the person's head at the time. But sometimes it could be that they knowingly engage in an act, they have that going on in their head, and death results. Now, the death might have resulted during the commission of something that was a misdemeanor or lesser than a felony, or even some lawful act. You see California. California defines it a couple different ways, right? They have a couple brands of sort of killing another human being without malice. They have a couple brands of manslaughter. Voluntary, we've seen that one. Heat of passion is kind of just like federal. You see some specific ones having to do with vehicular. You know, I'm causing, just during the driving of my car, not amounting to a felony, I need gross negligence. I need something that would, you know, amount to more than negligence, some wanton, reckless behavior. And then you see the involuntary one, also like federal, commission of an unlawful act not amounting to a felony, death during a lawful act that might produce death without due caution and circumspection. So what we're really talking about when we get down to involuntary manslaughter, statutory coming from the statute, but we're talking about when death occurs in sort of these other circumstances, not a reckless disregard for human life like implied malice or depraved heart, not a felony murder like we'll talk about in a separate video, when death results during the commission of certain felonies that are either enumerated in the statute or traditionally felony murders underlying crimes at common law. And sometimes death results when there's other types of activity going on, including you know, criminal negligence or criminal recklessness.